Hey everybody, so in this video we're going to talk about intercepts of a graph. Okay, and the first thing we want to do is just define what the intercept of a graph is. So in general, an intercept is a point where the graph is crossing the axis. Okay, and because we have two different axes, we have two different types of intercepts. Okay, so we would say that the x-intercept is the point where the graph crosses the x-axis. Now, depending on the graph, there might be more than one x-intercept. Okay. And then the y-intercept is going to be where the graph crosses the y-axis. Again, there could be, actually with the y-axis, if we're talking about a function, there can only be one because of the vertical line test that we talked about. Now, if you're talking about a graph that's not necessarily a function, there might be more than one y-intercept. Okay, so we're going to look at this graph that I have here, and we're going to just visually inspect it and find the axes. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say that this is the graph of f of x. Okay, and the first thing we're going to do is find any x-intercepts. Okay, and then second, we're going to find the y-intercepts. Okay, so if I look at this graph and I'm looking at the x-axis, right, we know that that's the horizontal axis, this one here. Okay, so I'm looking for the point where that axis crosses my graph. Now you can see that the point where the axis crosses the graph is going to be this point right here. So that point is 1, 2, a little bit more than 3, right? So I would say that this is the point 3.5, comma 0. Right? The y part of this graph is 0 because there's no up or down movement. Okay? So let's look at the y-intercept here. So the y-axis is the vertical axis, this one here. So again, I'm looking for the point where this graph crosses that axis. So I can tell I'm looking at this point right here. Okay, so that point is a little bit under -1. So I might say this is -1.2 or something. Okay, now remember the x part of the graph is the up and down part, and the y part of the graph is the up and down part, and the x part of the graph is the left and right component. So when we're looking at this particular point, there's no left or right component because it's on the y-axis, right? So this is going to be 0, -1.2. Okay. So it's really important that you give these intercepts as full ordered pairs, okay? Because it is a point on the graph. The intercept can't just be a single number, it has to be a whole ordered pair, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about how we can find intercepts based on an equation, okay? So let's talk about that next. Sometimes we'll be looking at a graph and we can find the intercept the way that we just did, but other times, and probably more likely, we're looking at an equation and we'd like to use the intercepts to make a graph. Okay, so let's look at an example like that. Oh. So okay. Now, to find the x and y intercepts, so for part A, we'll go ahead and find the x-intercept. Okay, and then for part B, we'll find the y-intercept. Okay, now to do that, we're going to use what we saw in the previous example, right? The x-intercept is along that horizontal axis, okay? So when we think about the points on that horizontal axis, any point along that, any possible x-intercept, right, is going to be with the y value being 0. Right? All those points along that axis have the y part being 0. And it's the opposite for the y-intercept. Right? Because it's along that vertical axis, all the x parts are 0. Okay. Now this is true for any type of equation, but because right now we're talking about linear functions, we're going to use linear functions as an example. Okay, so let's go ahead and find the x-intercept. Now we know for the x-intercept that y is equal to 0. So I'm going to take my equation and I'm going to plug in y equals 0. Okay, now 4 times 0 is 0. So I get 3x equals 24. And when I divide by 3 on both sides, I get that x equals 8. Okay? Now this is when it's important to remember that the intercept is an ordered pair, right? So when I look at my ordered pair, the first number is x. We can see that x is 8. Okay? But don't forget how we got started. We got started with y equals 0. So that's the y part. Let's look at the y-intercept. So we're going to start with our basic equation again, and this time we're going to plug in x equals 0. So I have 3 times 0 plus 4y equals 24. 3 times 0 is 0. So I have 4y equals 24. And when I divide both sides by 4, I get y equals 6. Okay, so again, I'm not going to forget to list this as an ordered pair. Now, y equals 6, we know that, so we're going to put the 6 there. But don't forget, we actually know what x is also. That's how we started the problem. We know that x is 0. Okay, so the biggest mistake that I see with these problems is instead of listing the 2 points separately, students will try to combine them, right? But the x and y intercepts in general are going to be 2 different points, okay? All right, that's it for now about intercepts, and I will see you guys in class.